All right, everyone, thank you for coming out to this event on the New Great Depression. My name's Ryan. I'm the chair of the Maoist Communist Union, and we are a pre-party organization here in the United States. Pre-party means we are not yet a revolutionary party in the sense of a party of the working class capable of leading the revolutionary struggle, the struggle of the proletariat, the working class, but all the oppressed peoples. But we aim to build that, both through our work locally and through our national efforts. We have a number of documents on our website. You can read our document, for example, Growing as a Pre-Party Organization, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what we do and how we hope to build up to eventually creating a revolutionary party. With that being said, today's focus is on the New Great Depression, which is sort of just getting started, or as I said earlier, hasn't really started yet. Namely, we have not yet seen the associated crashes that we would expect for a New Great Depression to really start, but we see a lot of the warning signs of a major economic catastrophe to come. People already probably have some sense of that with gas prices so persistently high, with inflation going through the roof, with the difficulty finding jobs and so on, but it's only going to get significantly worse. And today, the hope is that I can demonstrate that not only are we facing a significant economic crisis, that's in fact coming, that this will likely exceed in scope and intensity the dot-com bubble and 2008, probably combined, but also that this is tied to the overall decline of US imperialism, not its elimination, but its declining status globally, and that I can ground all this in some basic understanding of Marxist political economy. Because if you open up Bloomberg News or watch CNBC, you can see there a good deal of trepidation amongst bourgeois economic analysts about the AI bubble, about valuations of stocks being so high, all-time records and price-to-earning ratios, just a few companies making up the majority of the market capitalization. But all of that does not, of course, a Marxist analysis make. So this presentation, unlike some of my other ones, will cover a little bit more on the technical side of political economy, and we'll get to that in a little bit, which might be a little challenging. That's okay, and when we have the Q&A at the end, we'll go through that a bit. So let me show you our rough agenda. So we'll start off just breaking down, is there a crash coming? And we'll talk about the AI bubble and some signs of that. And then we'll get into some of the Marxist political economy, namely to explain the fundamental cause of political crises, because if you don't understand what's going on fundamentally with the thing, and you just see the emergent phenomena, you can be really confused. A great example, we just had Fred Engst speak. He talked about this with regards to the development of capitalist rotors. He says, if you just look at the surface, it's hard to tell. You see a bunch of maggots, you think, these could never turn into anything that's flying. They're just little weird worms crawling around. But eventually they grow wings. And if you understand the fundamental processes of how insects develop, you get a sense of that. Well, so too with capitalist crises. We'll talk about gold, money, and capitalism, as these things are often misunderstood, especially in today's world of supposedly fiat currencies. And then we'll talk about a historical parallel to today, in certain regards, and parallel by analogy, not direct one-to-one comparison, but the collapse of the Bretton Woods institutions and the Bretton Woods system that happened at the beginning of the 70s. And that has some very important lessons for us to understand. Then we'll shift back to the present, talk about the confidence that various countries around the world have or don't have in the stability of the US empire. And lastly, we'll talk about some fundamentals of crisis and revolution. All right, and this, of course, is a very famous photo of a mother and her children in one of the many tent cities that sprung up around the US during the Great Depression. We kind of functionally have those today with homeless encampments, but likely as things get worse, these sort of phenomena will intensify. We've already seen intensification of these phenomena since 2008, and the solutions the ruling class has put out has been, like in San Francisco, lovely progressive San Francisco, where a police officer can declare a homeless person mentally ill and lock them away for 1 year and force all sorts of treatment on them without any charges being pressed against them. So we can see more of that coming. And there'll be, because of that, more resistance. So we'll get into all that. Okay, so the question really that we see over and over again is, will there be a crash? And generally, in the euphoria of the insanity of whatever bubble's going on, a whole bunch of analysts who are making money, it seems, hand over fist, say, no. And they go, what goes up will never come down. This is Micron. It's a stock which famously had a big rise and crash in 2001. It's gone up like 1,350% over the last year. Now, this is a company that makes memory. for anyone who knows anything about how memory stocks do, like RAM for your computer and so on, they're very cyclical. There's, a big boom in the tech industry, it goes up, and then it crashes, as soon as the build out of new tech infrastructure stops. The scale of the present AI bubble, as you can see, is something that really dwarfs anything in the past, actually, in terms of the dot-com bubble or 2008, or even like the COVID crash. And again, Micron is one of many. So there's a huge bubble in AI. We're going to talk about it a little bit because a huge amount of all of the hot money is chasing after this AI bubble. And the way capitalism works, for those who don't know, is that capital always looks for an above average rate of profit. So wherever the latest boom is, people pour money into it. If you remember when there was like the tablet boom, suddenly every company had a tablet. Investors were shifting money out of their companies and into tablet industry. And why would you put your money into your existing production, maybe expanding it, making, say, a new shoe factory, when you could instead invest in tablets, or in this case, graphics cards and so on and so forth, and memory. And if you want to get a sense of how insane this bubble is, here's another example. We have Allbirds, which was a shoe company. Its stock was down 99%, and then it announced it was actually becoming an AI company. And how it was going to do that and what that would entail, details don't matter. It went up 837% in the stock market the next day. So you see what I'm saying? There's sort of a mania that develops in the peak of a bubble where people are like, take my money out of whatever it's in and throw it into whatever the bubble is. Because so-and-so I heard is getting rich hand over fist. And if you know much about how investment works, generally a company won't immediately develop return on investment. For example, OpenAI isn't projected to run a profit, according to their own estimates, until 2030. But more and more money is being poured into it, because if you put money into it, you might get a 3 to 5% return above the average. So if someone else was getting 4% return, you plug your money into OpenAI, you might get 7% return a year. But if you're getting 7% of your investment back a year, you've got a long while to go before you recoup your full investment, let alone actually turn a net profit on that investment. And if any time in the meantime there's a crash, you're in trouble. Just a little bit of basics, not even of Marxist political economy, just a little bit of how investment works. And if we look at the biggest companies in the world right now, the biggest 12 companies have a combined market cap of 29 trillion. And Elon Musk is about to have SpaceX go public, which will likely make him the world's first trillionaire. There's, historically various metrics like this at the peak of a bubble, like generally the biggest new skyscraper in the world gets built right before the crash, like the Empire State Building or the Burj Khalifa for 2008 or so on and so forth. And this is sort of another metric. Do you have like the new richest person ever? And then generally there's a big crash if it's a big leap. Now this is not conclusive evidence, but I'm just giving you a sense of the degree of the present bubble. So you have some knowledge of what's going on if you haven't been following the insanity of the AI world. And one big problem that's arising now for AI companies is they're starting to actually charge their users something approaching what the actual cost of using AI is. And as Sam Altman recently said, oh geez, we're kind of running into problems with AI costs. Suddenly, as we've increased prices, companies are complaining about how much it costs to use AI, because a whole bunch of companies thought they could replace their receptionists and their programmers and everyone else who had a white-collar job with AI. And as long as they were getting very heavily subsidized AI bills, it was feasible. But recently, for example, Uber ran through their entire AI budget in, I think, 1 month, their entire annual AI budget. In 1 month. And now they're freaking out and they're saying, okay, we got to really limit the amount of tokens everyone can use. Tokens are like the currency basically used with AI. But the problem is that if you limit the amount of tokens, then you can't use AI to replace all the people you already laid off or fired. And so these sort of problems are exactly what we expect to see at the peak of an AI bubble. Namely that finally the mania is fading and people are realizing the return on investment in switching over to AI is not there. And to get a sense of the very complicated funding dynamics in AI, we can look at this chart that came out, actually this was earlier this year on Bloomberg, but you see there's a lot of money being passed around. OpenAI is investing in NVIDIA, NVIDIA's then investing back in NVIDIA's investing in OpenAI, OpenAI is then using that money to buy more graphics cards from NVIDIA, Microsoft's investing in OpenAI, giving them some gift cards basically, and OpenAI is using those to, buy stuff from Microsoft. And it's very, very complicated. On the one hand, other hand, I found this really great graphic that sort of distills it down. And the reality is that you can find these sort of memes online. This is a pretty accurate representation of what's going on. If NVIDIA invests $100 billion in OpenAI, and they say, oh, we're doing a big new investment, and then OpenAI says, oh, we got $100 billion, and then we bought a big bunch of chips from NVIDIA, and NVIDIA says, oh, we did $100 billion of new sales. It doesn't really actually mean that there's much in the way of growth happening here, let alone anything approaching a sustainable business model. Okay, hopefully this clarifies at least to some degree the insanity that's going on in AI right now. I think there's like hundreds of new data centers being rolled out. In AI alone, the infrastructure expenses for AI now exceed the total public infrastructure expenses of the whole country. Yeah, so they're spending more on these data centers and stuff than they're on roads and water and everything else. And you guys, we can eat AI, we can drink AI, we can drive around on AI. No, of course not. And of course, there's also, actually I think like hundreds, well over 200 new groups that have spawned in the last year alone, protesting against data centers and AI around the country. And so there's mass resistance to these new rollouts, especially as even places like Lake Tahoe are being told, where a lot of wealthy people go, you won't have water anymore because we got to divert it for the new data center. Which if people like the bourgeoisie who goes on vacations in Tahoe is being told this, you're not going to get water anymore. How do you think it goes if you're in a poor rural community in Ohio and a new data center is coming to town? Now that doesn't show that definitively there's a bubble, that last point, but it just shows the type of mass opposition and resistance that's growing to the rollout of these new data centers. And in order to sustain the present bubble, they need to keep building at a breakneck pace. And if you have huge protests all over the country, everywhere you try to build a new data center, you can't so easily keep the mania going. Okay, so hopefully that at least convinces you there's something of a bubble in AI, if you didn't already believe that. But of course, a bubble in AI does not a new Great Depression make. So let's look at some other things like the impact of the Iran war. Well, as you probably know, countries around the world are running low on fuel or already out of fuel because 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas supply is currently offline from the Iran war and will not be restarted at least for 12 to 18 months and probably longer. And then even if it does, you got to build back up supplies and restart industry that was shuttered and so on and so forth. And it's not just liquefied natural gas, it's also oil. It's also the diesel fuel. And if you're not aware, diesel is used for trucking, for shipping, for generating power. And what happens if you can't ship goods or generate power? Yeah, a whole bunch of businesses go out of business. And if you think about that, just think about the level of interdependency of the global economy. If some trucks can't move goods, and California is about to run out of diesel, if some trucks can't move goods to deliver to factories, those factories can't make goods to deliver to other factories, those other businesses can't make consumer goods, the banks which lent to all of those businesses suddenly can't get money back on their investment, they start to have to call in their other loans to get their own money back from other places they've invested, which means very quickly you have a seizing up of the whole chain of payments. And we keep going through this, this is not just some random person on Twitter, actually, it's a decent analysis. But the Vice President Exxon warned that, this was just a few days ago, that we're 2 to 3 weeks away from a massive energy shock. This is because the US has some degree of domestic refining capacity and its own domestic oil production, and had some still remaining reserves of oil, which are all being drawn down after this war started. And the US is one of the countries, as the most powerful country in the world, and the biggest empire in the world, that's well positioned to weather this storm relative to others. But for poor countries like India or the Philippines or Pakistan, can you imagine what it's going to be like very quickly when they run out of fuel? It's going to be a huge, huge mess. And again, it's not just fuel, it's not just gas, it's things like aluminum, which the biggest aluminum smelters are now shut down. They're all in the Gulf. And even if they weren't shut down, they couldn't ship out. It's things like helium. Helium, a huge portion of it is produced in the Gulf, and helium is essential for all production of semiconductors, which means all electronics go. You say, electronics, you just computers and AI? No, cars. Remember during COVID, when suddenly, because of the lack of chips, they couldn't make cars because they didn't have the semiconductors to make the windows go up and down. I mean, a huge portion of our economy is now digitized in part, meaning not just on the computers, but dependent on some element of computer technology. And of course, in a certain sense, very fundamental to the economy, fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. And when fertilizer prices skyrocket, food prices go up. And when food prices go up, either poor people can't eat, or people have to get significantly higher wages to be able to eat, which then impacts the cost of all the goods across the economy. And of course, as just came out yesterday, one of the big shipping companies in the world estimates that 10% of global shipping will be forced to stop next month. 1/10 of global shipping will be forced to stop next month because of diesel shortages. And the current economy globally is very, very, very highly levered, meaning there's a huge amount of debt taken out on everything. You know, US government debt, corporate debt, household debt, etc. So if one company goes bankrupt and they can't pay someone else back, the chain of failure becomes very big. Okay, so we've got the AI bubble. We've got all these physical shortages which will lead to production disruptions across the world, and are already, and this will intensify. And you can imagine the political instability, I'm not even dealing with that yet, but that will come with this. And then we have an incredibly indebted world. This is US debt to GDP ratio. You can see that vertical line, that's COVID, but the debt to GDP is very, very high right now. It's the highest, basically it's ever been outside of wartime. I think World War II, it was slightly higher for a very brief period. And this is not sustainable. And you can tell it's not sustainable for a number of reasons. I mean, to give you a sense of it, I think it's 1/5 of all the US debt now was created while Trump was president. And 1/4 of all the US dollars ever printed have been printed since 2020. So you're running huge government deficits, borrowing a huge amount of money, and printing money hand over fist. You get a sense of how that probably ends with bankruptcy and or massive inflation. And if you look at the actual US government budget, it doesn't really look good. The interest payments are rising. What's more, that's because of the debt, but also the interest rates are rising rapidly now because of falling confidence in the US government and in the dollar, meaning that people around the world, mainly large corporations, central banks, etc., are demanding that they get a higher rate of interest when they lend money to the US government. They feel it's more risky than ever to lend money to the US government, meaning that on a very, very large pool of debt, the US has to pay a higher rate of interest. And if US GDP growth is like 3% a year, and the US is paying 5% in interest, that's -2 rate of return, -2% annual rate of return, right? Because the economy's not growing fast enough, to keep up with the interest rates. All of this, I'm trying to explain, basically is totally unsustainable. And what we are really looking at here is the end of a global order that was crafted after World War II, which is going to come tumbling down in spectacular fashion. How that will play out is something we'll get into, and there's a lot of contingencies, so we can't tell the future, we can just predict some of the possibilities. But this picture, like think about the Great Depression for a second. You had huge stock market valuations, you had the weakening of the British Empire, you had a lot of problems in terms of the imperialist system. Increasingly, countries had trouble expanding, they're all bumping into each other, the imperialist powers and gobbling up new colonies, and eventually you have the outbreak of World War II. But before that happens, you have this big economic downturn. Now think about the picture I'm showing you now. The bubble's bigger, the debt ratio is way higher, the impact on the global economy is more severe because production is also shut off from this war in a way that it wasn't in 1929. So we're looking at a scale that far, far exceeds actually the Great Depression, or at least has the potential to exceed the scale of disruption then. And you don't have to take my word for it, just look at what the bourgeoisie is doing. Warren Buffett, perhaps the most successful long-term investor in the US bourgeoisie, is holding a record amount of cash right now. He has this holding company that he manages the wealth of a huge number of very, very, very powerful people in the US and around the world. And his corporation, Berkshire Hathaway, is holding a record amount of cash, meaning they're not investing in the stock market, they've pulled out of a lot of the AI bubble, and they're just sitting on money. And the last few times he's done this was right before the COVID crash and right before 2008. So he's basically been given his inside sources and relatively more objective picture of how the economy functions, able to predict with a decent degree of accuracy economic downturns. Sorry, I keep hitting this. And if we look at the present stock market, what we see is that the valuations are very, very high. So this is a series of recent crashes. The recession, yes or no, that's just whether the government called it a recession. It's not so important. But the thing to look at here is what it says there, Kate, that peak. And really we're looking at the price to earnings ratio. That's the price of the stock relative to how much money the company earns. The higher the price to earnings ratio is, the more you're paying for the ownership of a company relative to their earnings. So the more expensive the company is relative to how much money they're making. So if you look at the Great Depression, this was around 32.6% then. Right now it's a little bit over 40%. So stocks, according to this metric, and it's basically the key metric, are currently significantly more overvalued than the Great Depression. And the dot-com boom is the closest precedent. With the dot-com crash, we saw basically a 50% drawdown in the stock market. And that was without the US collapsing as the world power, without major disruptions because of a war and so on. And another indication of the depth of potential crisis comes in lovely Peter Thiel moving to Argentina. He said, okay, what does this have to do with anything? I thought he was just leaving that because he's mad, or because he loves Milei, or because all the Zionists are burning the forest down in Argentina to buy the land. All those things are true. I don't know if he literally loves Milei. I don't know if Peter Thiel is capable of love, but yeah. But actually, Thiel did the same thing right before the dot-com boom. He went abroad, partially to Brazil and elsewhere. He wasn't in the office. He just was like, I got to get out. And the bourgeoisie not only has places to go in countries like Argentina or Honduras, they also have bunkers in New Zealand. They generally leave the US before a crisis, some of them at least, if they're very worried about domestic instability. And Thiel is somewhat extremely hated right now in the US. So he's a bit worried, that's my impression at least. And so he leaves the country. Now this last one is a bit more tongue-in-cheek, but the point is we have in front of us basically a whirlwind of overlapping factors. Now, since 1827, roughly every 10 years, there's been an economic crisis. This is what Marx called the decennial cycle, what the bourgeois economists call the business cycle. Basically, there's a boom phase, and then there's a bust, and then there's like a stagnation for a few years, then things start to pick up again, there's another boom, and then there's a crash. This is modified somewhat by major wars, by events like COVID, but roughly every 10 years. Within there's smaller ups and downs of the inventory cycle that happens every 2 to 4 years. And then there's roughly every 50 years a major crash that's tied up to various economic factors, but also contingent factors. The Great Depression came at a time of very intense competition between the world powers. The last major crash we had of the scale we're talking about today was roughly 50 years ago with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, where the US in its position in the post-World War II order was shaken up drastically. We're going to get into the Bretton Woods system a little bit, and there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn today. But the point I'm driving at is we have a concatenation of factors every time we have a major crisis, like the 70s, where for those who don't know, there was basically zero economic growth and massive inflation. And actually, if you factor in the actual inflation numbers and not the government's inflation numbers, it was basically a classical depression, like the Great Depression all through the 70s. So the 70s and the Great Depression, these were the last two big prolonged crises, and it seems that we're heading into another one. Okay, to ground this a little more in Marxist theory, we'll talk a little bit about the fundamental cause of capitalist crises, because all this so far is some relatively empirical data with me mixing in some historical comparisons, but we need to ground this in Marxist theory in order to understand what's really going on. So I'm going to bring up a somewhat dense quote from Capital Volume 3, and we'll be able to basically break it down together. So in Capital Volume 3, Marx says, the true barrier to capitalist production is capital itself. It is that capital and its self-valorization appear as the starting and finishing point, as the motive and purpose of production. Production is already production for capital, and not the reverse, i.e. the means of production are not simply means for a steadily expanding pattern of life for the society of producers. The barriers within which the maintenance and valorization of capital has necessarily to move, and this in turn depends on the dispossession and impoverishment of the great mass of producers, therefore come constantly into contradiction with the methods of production that capital must apply to its purpose, and which set its course towards an unlimited expansion of production, to production as an end in itself, to an unrestricted development of social productive powers of labor. The means, the unrestricted development of the forces of social production, comes into persistent conflict with the restricted end, the valorization of the existing capital. If the capitalist mode of production is therefore a historical means for developing the material powers of production and for creating a corresponding world market, it is at the same time the constant contradiction between this historical task and the social relations of production corresponding to it. Okay, that's very dense. I'm throwing you into Capital Volume 3, which I don't know how many people have read here, but if you haven't read 1 and 2, it's hard. So I understand that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a brief overview of all the main points of Capital Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3, and then we'll understand a little. Okay, obviously not. That would be maybe a few weeks of solid presentation with no break for me to even go to the bathroom. So what Marx is saying here, and I'll summarize it briefly and I'll have a graphic to help explain, is that basically there's an inherent problem in capitalism itself with developing production. And for anyone who actually wants to see human beings get beyond the supposed pinnacle of life being middle-class suburban America, or maybe middle-class like yuppie existence in the cities, then we do want to develop production. Not just to raise up the living standard in poor countries, but to do a hell of a lot more than that, and even to eventually get off planet Earth. I mean, if Elon Musk is talking about taking people to Mars, then damn, under socialism, we better be able to do something a lot better than that. And do that too, obviously. And leaving aside the questions of actual expansion to other planets or so on and so forth, what Marx is pointing out here is that capitalism, in its very nature, on the one hand, expands production, but on the other hand, because its goal is to valorize capital, this is actually a constant impediment to the development of society. What do we mean by valorize capital? Well, capital is a social relation whereby a very small number of humans who, for historic reasons, control in their hands or in their bank accounts the vast majority of wealth, the collective labor of all of our past generations of ancestors, a small number of tiny exploiting parasites. They control that. And they use that collective wealth that should belong to all of us to further enslave and immiserate us. Meaning that how you work, what you can buy, how you spend your time, how we transport goods, how we produce stuff, how medicine is done, everything is controlled by them for their private needs, for their further enrichment and for their continued domination of the society. I mean, how much of society's resources in the US, in China, and all the countries around the world go to this massive repressive apparatus, surveillance, police, military, missiles, drones, etc., to keep us in chains and to be ready in case either the people rise up or some group of foreign capitalists try to grab a little bit of what the domestic capitalists think is their own right. I mean, that's an insane system. And that system comes into constant conflict with the social nature of production. To put it differently, how many people work together at Amazon? And how many people who work at Amazon actually see anything approaching a bit of the share of the wealth they produce? I mean, the engineers, sure, but the vast majority of people, and even a lot of the lower level engineers now, are getting very little. In fact, if you took the minimum wage in 1970 and adjusted it for inflation, just the government's official inflation numbers, which are a massive underestimate, you'd have to make $71 an hour right now to make what was minimum wage in 1970. So if you think about even being an entry-level engineer at Amazon, you're not really making much money. And then think about how little all those warehouse workers make at Amazon. So all those people work together and they enrich Bezos and the Amazon shareholders. Collective labor very socialized labor, because they're actually moving goods from all over the world, produced all over the world. Tiny private group appropriates not just the goods, but most importantly, the profit. And they use this profit to further enrich themselves and to go to space and to have luxury yachts and everything else, but mostly to enrich themselves. And so can we think of a good visualization for this? That Marx says this is the fundamental limiting factor in capitalist production. Well, there's a great one from the IWW. It's right here. It's very simple. You have all the wealth created by labor and this tiny little pittance of wages given to the working class. And a lot of that wealth created by labor then goes back into production, but the capitalists also get to take a bunch of it for themselves, to spend on luxury goods, to hoard to various degrees, to invest in whatever crazy bubble, to buy a private island like Kushner and Ivanka are doing to replace Epstein Island. Although in Albania, they just burned down the president's house, so it may not happen. And we see this system, it creates a series of problems because, for example, let's take a Toyota factory. The workers at Toyota factories, they're paid all right compared to Amazon warehouse workers, but not paid great, a lot of them, especially in the non-unionized shops in the South. Do they have, or any other workers, really the wages to buy up all those Toyotas that are produced? If there's profit? No, because look at the gap. Wealth created by labor versus wages. I mean, this is one visual representation, but it gives you a sense. This is the production of what Marx called surplus value. I'm not going to get into all the technicals because we have got to get Capital Volume 1 to get into that, but this is the basic thing. And so what happens is each and every year, there's a huge number of goods that can't be sold. This is what's called a car graveyard. This is particular one is outside of Baltimore, Maryland. These are all over the country. These are not old cars. These are not used cars. These are new cars that are made every single year that are never sold. They are left to rot, to rust, and to fall apart because the capitalists would rather not decrease the price. They'd rather not sell. This is across the board, actually, what capitalist production requires. So you already know how wasteful and stupid capitalism is in certain senses, like all these stupid like AI videos, slot videos that we're wasting a huge amount of energy and water and so on are. But think about how many people's lives are wasted producing vehicles that no one will drive, that the capitalists don't sell to anyone so that they can keep the prices high. I mean, it's actually insane. But of course, given that there's this big gap between wages and the wealth created by labor, there arises a question. Well, why doesn't capitalism just have a crisis right away? Because after all, they can't quite sell all the goods that are produced, right? If there's this gap, again, look at the size of the two bags. Workers are only paid a pittance, but workers create all this wealth. Who's gonna buy all that stuff? I mean, some of it will be bought by the capitalists, but the rest of that big bag, who's buying all that stuff? And if cars are rotting and rusting and food's being wasted and thrown out, and anyone who works in food service knows how much you throw out, why isn't there a crisis right away? The answer, in short, is that there's an ability of the market to absorb, the capitalist market, the world market, to absorb some degree of the surplus that's produced. And Engels says, under capitalism, this is from the preface to the English edition of Capital, while the productive power increases at a geometric ratio, the extension of markets proceeds at best at an arithmetic one. Okay, what does that mean? He's using somewhat antiquated language. What he means is that production expands exponentially, whereas the market expands linearly. So you can see in this image that initially, if the exponential growth may even be lower than the expansion of the market, that means the capitalists have plenty of extra wiggle room, there's plenty of money to go around that they can sell their goods for, but eventually money gets tight. And when you see actually interest rates rising, the cost of borrowing money increasing, that's when you know the capitalists are struggling to get enough money to buy the goods they need to run their businesses to one degree or another. And this happens towards the end of every single economic cycle. Interest rates start to rise and rise and rise, and the Fed says, is the economy overheating? And then you have a crash. Okay, and this doesn't just happen for corporations and for governments, but of course for individuals. Actually, to help keep capitalism afloat, there's all sorts of consumer credit. Student loans, mortgages, credit cards, other types of consumer loans. And they use this because there's no way with that tiny little bag the workers get that they could possibly buy all the goods that are produced. But we still have a question here. And a question maybe you all haven't quite realized yet, but basically the question is, what ultimately limits the rate of growth of the market? Couldn't the capitalists just keep printing money and making more loans and just grow debt forever? Like, does there have to be some sort of halting point? And the answer, which is tied up with the basic Marxist understanding of political economy, can actually be found on the front page of this lovely Wall Street Journal. And I don't mean that Zoran's the answer and is going to solve all our problems, nor do I mean he's the cause of crises. It's just, if you look at the Wall Street Journal, the kind of preeminent economic business newspaper in the United States every day, you'll see something very interesting. Along the top of it, above the headlines, but below the masthead, you'll see a bunch of different things. The stock indices, different currencies, oil, which obviously serves a very key role in the capitalist economy, and then you'll see gold. Now, why is gold up there? I mean, gold is kind of useful for some computer processes, but in terms of its role in production of goods, it's nowhere near as important as oil. It's not a currency, and according to the capitalists, at least since 1971, with the end of the Bretton Woods system, it's not important monetarily, they say, but strictly speaking, this isn't true. Because for those who don't know, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in the Bretton Woods system, it used to be the case that currencies were tied to gold explicitly. The United States dollar, up until 1971, was directly convertible into gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. The technical details aren't so important, but there was a direct convertibility. And this was because the dollar in and of itself, like all other currencies, did not have inherent value. It was a form of credit money, an agreement that you had a right to a certain amount of the money commodity, which is gold. The generally accepted wisdom amongst bourgeois economists is that after 1971, all the world's currencies became fiat currencies, issued by fiat. The banks just said, we give out currency, and everyone just accepted that, and then gold doesn't matter anymore. And this actually has spawned a whole series of theories on the right and on the left about how actually the government can just print as much money as it wants. In fact, on the left, there's a whole theory called modern monetary theory that says, so what? Elizabeth Warren pioneers this. Biden's economic advisor famously talked about this in an interview and couldn't explain anything about it. The government can just print as much money. It doesn't matter. We can just fund all the social programs, just print money. Of course, that's not true. This is because under capitalism, one single commodity actually has to come to represent the social nature of labor. Now, what the hell does that mean? And we are getting a little bit technical. I know it's a bit of a challenge because in order to explain the Marxist understanding of crisis, we have to get a bit technical, but I think it's actually not so hard to understand. So how do you meet most of your daily needs? What percentage, actually just a raise of hands here, what percentage of people make over 50% of their daily needs themselves? 5%? Right? I mean, the most people will do who aren't in an agricultural society is cook their own food. Do you make your own clothes? Do you produce your own power? Do you make your own internet? Do you make your own refrigerators? Maybe you like work on your car or your bike a little bit. Do you make the bike yourself? No, you can't. And we're not like anarcho-primitivists. We don't want to go back in time to when everyone made a lot of their own stuff. But on the other hand, it's a weird system we have right now where the vast majority of everything you get is produced by other people in very complicated social processes. And yet, we're all private consumers. And so what you have to do is to ensure that people get their daily needs, because we don't have a plan to distribute goods to people according to need, or even according to the work they do, is have a system of exchange whereby people have to trade with others through money to meet basically all of their daily needs. And it's actually an insane system when you think about it. Like, we're working all together to make a very small number of rich people richer, And we're working socially to do that, and yet to meet all of our daily needs, we have to trade all the time. And we're not utopian saying, let's just forget about all that. No, in order to deal with that, you have to have a revolution. You can't just overcome it by realizing it's absurd, any more than you can overcome the fact that it's absurd that Jeff Bezos owns Amazon just by realizing it. It's absurd. But this system, it requires that a certain commodity basically have a directly social nature. Now, what does that mean? Why am I talking about that? Directly social, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that, let's say you're working at a factory making sodas. Okay, you're making tons of sodas. Do you know that your sodas are going to sell as opposed to another soda? No. How do you prove that the labor that went into the sodas at your factory, or the labor that the workers did, if you're a capitalist, at your factory, has any sort of value for the society? It actually is useful and socially necessary. You have to sell those goods in the market. And for every good, that's the case, because it could be the case that some new other soda company came out and is selling soda that's more popular or cheaper or whatever. And so it could be the case that all the work that was done in your factory, or 10% of it or 20% of it, like we see with those cars, was in fact socially useless labor. And given the waste under capitalism, and we know how much is thrown out, there's a lot of socially useless labor. A lot of stuff that gets produced that has no real social utility. More cars than people need, or more cars than can be sold, actually, even if people still need cars. But there's one commodity where the labor in it is already directly social, because it becomes separated out through a historical process whereby it's immediately recognized as directly social. And that is the production of gold as the money commodity. And I'll come to Marx's writing about it in a second. But basically what happened after 1970, when countries went off the gold standard, is the central bank of the United States and a bunch of other central banks gave up their ability to control the direct exchange ratio of their currency for gold, and instead got to control the amount of currency they put into circulation. So instead of being able to say you can always trade your dollar for $35 for an ounce of gold, they got to say we have X trillion amount of dollars in circulation, and they felt that was advantageous. And then therefore the price of gold in dollars fluctuates. So here's what Marx says. This physical object, gold or silver, and silver is basically no longer a money commodity, in its crude state becomes immediately on its emergence from the bowels of the earth, the direct incarnation of all human labor. Hence the magic of money. Men are henceforth related to each other in their social process of production in a purely atomistic way, all of us as individuals. Their own relations of production therefore assume a material shape, which is independent of their control and of their conscious individual action. This situation is manifested first by the fact that the products of men's labor universally take on the form of commodities, goods to be sold to others. The riddle of the money fetish is therefore the riddle of the commodity fetish, now become visible and dazzling to our eyes. So Marx's point here, this is not immediately empirically obvious, the nature of money and gold functioning as money. But ultimately, what limits the expansion and growth of the market in every boom cycle is the amount of gold that's produced. And basically, as every other commodity in the boom phase increases in price, the amount of gold that they exchange for decreases. And since capitalists seek the highest rate of profit, a lot of capitalists who were previously involved in gold mining and production shift out of gold. And we can actually see this. These are a couple of interesting charts. And what you can see, the one on the right is the most important. It's the chart of wholesale prices of goods in gold. And you can see before every major crash that has occurred, the price of other goods in gold increases, meaning that the profit rate of producing gold, the money commodity, decreases. And if there's less money, then there's a smaller market, and the goods are worth more, so you need more gold to be able to keep trading them, and there's not enough gold. And then inflation starts to kick up, and then the interest rate goes up, and then eventually there's a crash, and then you can see in all those gray areas, and a few other spots too, there's a big decrease in prices in gold terms. The profitability of gold mining goes back up, and gold production increases. And over again, and we'll see a different image later that I'll pull up when I talk about the Bretton Woods system, but ultimately, the actual physical material limitation on the expansion of the market is gold production. And gold prices are right now at records high. They've fallen a little bit from them, but they're still extremely, extremely high. Okay, that was a lot. I did a lot of technical stuff there. I understand not all of it's probably totally clear. The point here is not to totally clarify all three volumes of Capital, which are really needed to get into some sense of Marxist theory of crisis, but rather to at least give you a sense of two things. Again, one, the nature of surplus value and the gap between the value produced by labor versus the wages workers are paid, and how that's an inherent barrier to production in capitalism, and ultimately the root, in a certain sense, of the crises of overproduction. And two, how the crises occur because of an increase of production during the booms and the mania and the bubbles beyond what the market can handle, because the market's ultimately grounded in gold production. And what I mean by the market is how much and how quickly capital can turn over between investing in production, producing goods, selling them, investing in production again. And if there's not enough money, that can't be done. And eventually debts can't be paid, and there's a big crisis. Now, the capitalists develop all sorts of methods to mitigate this. Expansion of credit, things called clearing houses to offset different payments, to try to net out chains of payments. I debated having a whole section on that, but I realized people's heads would be swimming. I can go into a little bit at the end in the Q&A if people are interested, but I'm not going to get into it right now because it's already so much for an audience who's, at least a number of you probably aren't so familiar with Marxist political economy. So it's already a lot of technical stuff and new information. So with all of that, let's just keep that kind of in the back of our minds a little bit. And we'll come back to actually we'll come back to a few present day examples of what's going on and how this is all relevant, especially the gold question. But first, let's talk about the Bretton Woods system. I've referenced it like 7 times so far. And you all probably, at least some of you have no idea what it is. So let me get a sip of water and then we'll talk. So the Bretton Woods system is a system that was set up in the wake of World War II. It was set up literally in Bretton Woods in the resort in New Hampshire. And basically, it was a system the US set up with their various allied powers and also the defeated German and Japanese after World War II that established a system and a framework whereby under US leadership and under US domination, the various imperialist powers of the world would divide up the spoils of colonial plunder. The US didn't have as many colonies and actually supported the end of a lot of old colonialism to replace it with neo-colonialism, open markets that were not the exclusive domain of any one empire. And this was all done through the Bretton Woods system. So this is a little, actually pretty low quality graphic, but it was only one that gave some sort of relatively clear layout of it. So all the other currencies would exchange for dollars, which was pegged to gold. Okay, so let's go through a few points on it. So as I noted, this was a system to divide up the plunder. And capitalists divide up the plunder. It's a very simple law. Might makes right. So Britain, what happened to them in World War II? They had a big portion of their industrial base devastated by the German rockets. France was ripped apart by the German invasion and occupation. Germany, firebombed by the US and obliterated. This industrial base in West Germany, this was very weak. And so on. Japan, very much weakened. So the US said, we're the biggest empire in the world now. We had our whole industrial base not only intact, but even built up from the war. And the US actually had 54% of the world's industrial output under its direct control in the US after World War II. So they split up the pie of the plunder of the world, and the US got a huge share. All the currencies in the world, or the main currencies in the Bretton Woods system, were all pegged to the US dollar, which was pegged to gold at a fixed exchange ratio of $35 an ounce. All of this was supported by the incredibly brutal system of apartheid in South Africa, where the majority of the world's gold production happened. And so actually the struggle against apartheid was a key struggle, not only against the ruling class in South Africa, but against the whole US-led imperialist system. And the Great Depression, which had a driven down commodity prices very, very, very low. Actually set up the grounds after the war was over, along with the economic destruction caused by the war, for a huge economic boom that started in the 40s and ran basically without so much interruption all the way to 1970. But the bigger the boom, the bigger the crash. And there was a whole bunch of Keynesian policies that were pursued by the US ruling class in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to prolong the boom, but they also intensified the inevitable crisis. And so the US got lovely Mr. Richard Nixon. And he came in and he imposed price controls and tried to stop the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and actually just saw it fall apart. And so this whole system in the late 60s and then early 70s collapsed. It ended with the US closing the convertibility of the US dollar to gold at $35 an ounce, and that saw gold rise up to $800 an ounce in a few short years. So we'll talk about a little bit of this. So what caused the collapse? Well, first, during this boom phase, as the price of everything rose, in gold terms, gold became much, much less profitable to mine. And so there was a cyclical fall in gold production. And you can see in this graphic here in particular the fall in South African gold production after 1970. This is kind of a cool chart. It's kind of annoying because it doesn't just, it's not all in the top. I hate how they kind of split it, but still you get a sense. And you can see South African gold production really crumbled after the end of apartheid. Okay. There was a whole bunch of inflationary Keynesian policies. And we can actually, this is a nice graph that gives us a sense of it. You can see in the end of the war, after World War II ends in 45, and then all the way up to 1970, commodity prices skyrocket. But gold production in the top does not in any way keep up with the rising prices, meaning you have a shortage of money, so production is rising faster than the market. Again, what Engels' point, you've got this exponential rate of growth of production, and the market's growing linearly, and then eventually you have this crisis. Okay. And you have these big US government deficits to go along with it, and there's all these sharpening contradictions between the US and its allies in this period. For example, Charles de Gaulle met with Kennedy. There was a lot of kerfuffle because where was France's gold kept? In the US. And what did de Gaulle do? He eventually cashed out all of their gold. They said, we don't want dollars, we want our gold back. And they repatriated it out of the Bretton Woods systems to France. And this caused a huge crisis. Basically, this was the end of the Bretton Woods system. West Germany did it, and then everyone freaked out, all the other big US allies. And they were worried about their gold because the amount of US liabilities, external dollar liabilities, the amount of dollars out in the world far exceeded the US gold reserves, meaning they didn't have enough gold to pay everyone back if everyone cashed in their dollars. But more broadly, countries like France and Britain and West Germany, they were mad. They were like, hey, the deal we struck in 1945, it's not fair anymore. We want a bigger share of the pie. France wanted a bigger share of the loot in Africa. The US was getting unfair return on investment, as France felt. And I mention this because it's not just the US's major competitors that push pressure on it. The US allies, and there's obvious parallels today with the conflicts with NATO and with the EU, also put a lot of pressure on the US because as much as Trump or other members of the ruling class may believe they can just run roughshod all over their allies, the allies are powerful imperialist countries too, and they want their fair share. And then the Bretton Woods system also saw the US military defeats in Korea and Vietnam. Again, we see a lot of parallels today with Afghanistan, Iraq, now Iran. The US is getting beat pretty badly. And if the US is supposed to be the world's policeman under that system or under the modified but present system, how confident do you feel if you're France that the US is going to protect your neo-colonies in Africa? Especially when you're dependent on the US for military hardware, for refueling for your jets in air, for your cybersecurity stuff to some degree, and so on, for your nuclear umbrella to some degree for a lot of European countries. Not very confident. And then, of course, in the 60s and 70s, there was significantly increased domestic unrest and class struggle. The civil rights movement, the Panthers, the wave of the new communist movement and strikes, and so much more. And all of this left a lot of the ruling class around the world to be very worried about the solidity of the US empire. There was a competition with the Soviet social imperialists who at this point, after the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, were starting to aggressively fight the US for control of different neo-colonies, for control of different territory and markets and so on. And then there was the great proletarian cultural revolution in China, which inspired people all over the world, including in the US. I mean, the Panthers got started selling the Little Red Books, but also in India, the Naxalbari movement got started, taking direct inspiration from the Cultural Revolution in China, as did the revolutionary movement in the Philippines and all around the world. And all of this led to a bunch of very wealthy people in whole other countries becoming very worried about the stability of the US empire and very worried about the US dollar in particular. And so I'll read something I wrote here that deals a little bit more with the technical side of what stabilizes a currency and what is a currency's stability really about. The stability of a currency is not simply dependent on technical measures like the monetary base, monetary supply, and velocity of money, but also on the political and ideological relations between those who hold the currency and the political authority that issues it. These came under immense strain in the 1960s. This strain played a major role in the economic and political crisis the US capitalist class experienced in this period. With the end of the Bretton Woods system and the creation of token money, mistakenly called fiat dollars by some, the dollar and other currencies were no longer credit money which foreign central banks could exchange for gold. The dollar's monetary role as a token of value could only be maintained insofar as, quote, its function as a symbol is guaranteed by the general intention of commodity owners, as Marx put it. Or, to put it differently, only insofar as commodity owners saw US dollar denominated assets as viable investments. The challenges to the ruling class domestically and to the position of US imperialists internationally shook the confidence of commodity owners and saw them flee from the dollar to gold in this period. The stability of various currencies is therefore also a question of the relations between classes, including between various monopoly classes around the world. Now, what did this look like empirically? Well, let's look at the gold prices relative to the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the big stock index of a bunch of the key industries in the US. What you see is that between January 1971 and the mid-80s, or at least to the 1980, it's way, way, way more profitable to park your money in gold as opposed to buying US stocks. Now that creates a bunch of problems for the capitalist system. Because if you're a capitalist and you're just holding gold, are you producing any new surplus value? No. You may be getting personally richer, but you're not investing in new production to create more value to then further exploit the working class. And then are there a lot of jobs to go around if the capitalists aren't investing in more production? No, I mean, that's part of the barbarity of the capitalist system is if it's not profitable for the capitalists to invest, then there won't be that many jobs. And so what happened in the 70s, known as the stagflationary 70s, stagnation economically and huge inflation, is that there was very little in the way of economic production in the US. I mean, there was the basics to reproduce the society, but in terms of economic growth, there wasn't. And this is really when deindustrialization begins in the US. And this isn't really a conscious policy of the US ruling class. This is a major economic downturn and a huge number of investors, American and otherwise, putting their money in gold or investing in production around the world. And this created huge problems for the US ruling class. They lost a tremendous amount of global standing. And the argument is that we're going to be seeing something very similar in the present moment. And so we come to the question, in the US dollar we trust? Really, this is a question if foreign monopoly capitalists around the world trust the US dollar. Because the entirety of the dominance of the US ruling class, the US empire with its 800 military bases around the world and so much power, is dependent in large part, I said entirety, but the whole system is dependent. It's not only dependent on this, but it's very dependent on the US dollar's status as a world reserve currency. If that goes away, the US's ability to project power, to control markets, to make profit off the labor of the oppressed people collapses. So what we've seen over the last decade and a half is that foreign countries have not increased at all their US dollar holdings. Foreign central banks use US dollars to buy most goods on international markets. So the fact that these countries have not increased their US dollar holdings, even as the global economy has grown and even as inflation has weakened the purchasing power of the dollar, shows the lack of confidence that foreign governments and foreign corporations have in investments that are US dollar denominated. They're not ditching the US dollar. That would be a very drastic collapse rapidly, but they're not increasing their exposure to it. And in fact, in real terms, when accounted for inflation, they're decreasing. What this actually looks like, if we look at the US dollar as a share of global currency reserves, is a significant drop-off since a peak right before the dot-com boom. And actually, you can see the US fell off a good deal after the inflation of the 70s and reached a pretty low point in 91. And then what happened in 91? The collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the US's biggest imperialist rival, and the unipolar moment, the end of history, when the US was the only game in town. And then after the euro and then the weakening position of the US, again, even with competition with its allies, plus the rise of Chinese imperialism over the last few decades, the US dollar has consistently decreased as a share of global reserves, meaning countries are less and less invested in the dollar and more hedging their bets when it comes to the US market. Now, what we haven't seen is an expansion of exposure to the euro or to the yuan or to the ruble or any other currencies. Instead, what has it been? Anyone want to guess? Gold. We've seen in this period, first, just a massive uptick post-2008 in central bank gold buying, and then in the last 3-4 years, a doubling even from that increase as countries around the world are preparing for the devaluation and dealing with the reality of the ongoing devaluation of the US dollar. As they hoard gold, understanding on a certain level that the status of the US dollar as the world reserve currency is increasingly under threat. And in a very dramatic move this year with the start of the Iran war, in a very direct historical parallel to the Bretton Woods system, France pulled all of its gold out of the Federal Reserve. So we're literally, I think, seeing a type of collapse of the global economic order that happened with Bretton Woods happening again. And again, when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, the US was in a pretty strong position. They were losing Vietnam. They weren't getting kicked out of a whole region of the world. They weren't having their military bases destroyed. They didn't have a rival empire that was really capable of fighting them toe-to-toe. The Soviet Union was a few decades away from collapsing. In every single metric, China is beating the US. Economic production, basically everything except for already having a bunch of wealth invested around the world. And so the competition between the US and a bunch of other countries is heating up, but in particular, the European powers, the US allies, they're trying to reduce overall economic dependency on the US, which is not reducible to the US dollar. They also want to buy fewer American goods. They want to sell somewhat less to the American market, or at least be more resilient to upturns and downturns in the American market. They want to increase exports in certain regards too. And there's another major study, actually the last 3 years, every year there's been a major study done by the European Commission on how they can expand what they call strategic autonomy and improve European competitiveness. By this, they mean how the hell can they be less dependent on the US? This page on the right shows a little bit of what they're talking about. They're very clear. They want to be economically much more independent from the US. And if you're less dependent on the US, you buy more US goods? No, fewer. You rely more on the dollar? No, less. This is a huge threat to the US's status globally, because the US empire can only sustain itself as a uncontested or relatively uncontested global empire if it has a series of subordinate empires that help maintain its dominance. And we've seen this competition manifesting in Denmark saying it was going to blow up the Greenland runways if the US invaded Greenland. We've seen this in Brussels, the political center in Europe, building plans to merge European corporations to build mega corporations capable of competing with the US and China for market share globally. And we've seen this with France announcing it will expand its nuclear umbrella to cover all of Europe. And Whose nuclear umbrella currently covers all of Europe? The United States'. Now, these are all geopolitical indications of the signs of the decline of the US, which will not in and of themselves cause an economic crisis, but will weaken the United States government's ability to weather any crisis. The dot-com boom is a great example of how the US weathered a crisis, because the dot-com boom and bust, the bust didn't start in the US. It started about 3 years earlier with the so-called Asian tigers, with Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea and others facing a significant economic downturn. And when there was a downturn there, what happened? Investors pulled their money out and parked it where? In the US. And this, on the one hand, made the dot-com bubble heat up more, but it also helped to cushion the collapse that followed. Namely, the US economy took a hit with the dot-com crash, but it wasn't so bad. The real estate bubble was just getting rolling there, and the US kept on growing. If the US is no longer a safe haven for European or Asian investors to park their money during a crisis elsewhere, and in fact, if they're very worried about the US specifically, the US's ability to weather any crisis will be significantly weakened. And that's what we're seeing very clearly, is the geopolitical storm, which will mean that this coming downturn will hit the US harder than the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. And one area of extreme importance is the collapse of the Petrodollar recycling system that was set up when? Right after the end of the Bretton Woods system. This was how the US really ensured this continued status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Namely, they talked with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies and ensured that the oil that those countries traded or sold would only be sold in dollars. And those countries would then take the dollars they got from selling the oil and invest it in US government debt, which would keep US lending costs low, preserve the American empire, preserve dollar status globally, etc. This is broken down. 2 years ago, Saudi Arabia signed deals with China they would buy in yuan. They decided to reduce their dependence on the dollar. This happened in the midst of the Ukraine war as the US seized a bunch of Russian assets that were parked in Europe. Now with the Iran war, we're seeing the real end of the petrodollar system. Because if the US and the Gulf states cannot ensure the flow of oil and other resources through the Strait of Hormuz, there's no military power to back up the status of the dollar as the main currency that oil trades in, which means demand for dollars plummets. And if there's a whole bunch of dollars out there in circulation and they're not being used globally, what happens here? A hell of a lot more inflation. What's more, to keep countries like Saudi and the UAE more loyal, to have them shift, or to try to stop them from shifting to China, the US is printing money hand over fist. BESA just announced they're going to do currency swaps, where they get the UAE's currency and they give a bunch of free dollars basically to the UAE. And they did this to Argentina to bail them out and support Milei. This is printing money hand over fist and pumping it into a global system where the dollar is increasingly under threat. And if you're another country that owns dollars and you're worried about inflation and you see the US printing money hand over fist to give to its allies, how do you feel about your dollar holdings? Not so good. And of course, I already noted the confiscation of Russia's central bank funds during the start of the Ukraine war, $300 billion of investments taken. So if you're the UAE or Saudi and you're worried, what happens if the US gets mad at us if we sign a new trade deal with China, which the Saudis just did? Do you feel confident parking most of your money in the US economy? You're going to, at a minimum, hedge your bets, park some money in China, and so on. And then, of course, you have Trump talking about how the US are like pirates. It's so great about seizing oil tankers and shipping containers and so on around the world. I mean, this is not the behavior of an economic hegemon seeking to preserve economic stability. And a whole bunch of powers around the world that are somewhat anxious, when they see this sort of thing, they start to move money out of the dollar. And remember the quote I had up there, the general intention of commodity owners. Do they trust the authority of the US state and of the Federal Reserve, the entities that issue the dollar and dollar-denominated debt? Do they trust them? If not, they will work to reduce their exposure to the dollar. And if you're, say, not a relatively powerful country like a European imperialist, but a small little US-backed dictatorship like Afghanistan, how do you feel right now seeing scenes like this as the US pulls out of Afghanistan and all the compradors run to get on the plane and get run over by the plane? I mean, the fall of Saigon seems relatively tame in comparison. And then you look at the rising US government interest payments and the debt to GDP. Damn, it doesn't look good. And then you hear Trump say, America's a nation in decline. I agree with Xi Jinping. It's painting a grim picture. And it's a picture the Chinese ruling class is very aware of. The Chinese most powerful spy agency said actually they've won the competition with the US in a recent memo they put out. They said the whole question is how to just manage the decline of the US. There's no more US offensive against China. China now has the initiative, and the US empire is collapsing. And so as long as they can just manage that, the US won't lash out at China too much. The US will have to accept its brutal reduction eventually to a hemispheric power, no longer a global empire. Now, when you have a world economy that's built on a US empire, and you have a huge bubble in AI, and you have the collapse of that empire, and you have, how to put it, an unprecedented inflationary period where so many dollars have been printed to bail out everyone from the banks to Millet, what happens? I mean, you saw with Weimar, the Weimar Republic, post World War I, what happened? You just had huge inflation, and then you had economic collapse, and then you had the rise of fascism and aggressive expansion to try to restore the rightful place of Germany as the Nazis saw it. Now, I'm not saying the US will definitively turn fascist, and I think even if the US does, they won't be able to really do aggressive expansion given their decline, in contrast to what the Nazis were able to do. Of course, that ended up not working out so well for them anyways. But what we're seeing is a concatenation of factors that are putting far greater pressure on the US than anything that occurred even in the Bretton Woods system, where again, you saw a decade of economic stagnation. And this is why we're talking about a new Great Depression, or maybe even a larger scale. And the Great Depression occurred, again, when the US was actually on the rise. And the Bretton Woods system occurred when the US was facing some threat and had to give up some of its share. The crisis in the Bretton Woods system occurred. But basically, the US was able to weather that storm. But an empire going from a global power to a weak global power, or maybe just a hemispheric power, in conjunction with a massive global economic crash, it's going to be very, very destabilizing. And that's why a lot of businesses aren't hiring right now. I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek. They, of course, don't realize, like the local coffee shops don't realize this, but they have some sense of, oh, damn, it's kind of hard, or sales are falling, etc. Okay, with all of this painting a rough picture, and by no means comprehensive, of course, I can't get into all the political economy. Let's talk a little bit about crisis and revolution. So I'll read this quote in a second, but basically, if there is going to be a major economic crisis, immediately the question that arises, okay, does it mean we're gonna have a revolution? And the frank answer is we're pretty far from that right now. On the other hand, destabilizing things can change a lot. But just like in order to understand why there's going to be a major economic crisis, in order to understand, we've got to study some theory, so too to understand what type of political instability can arise from such an economic and geopolitical crisis for the ruling class, we have to understand the basic nature of crises, political crises for ruling classes, and how they can become revolutionary crises and under what conditions a revolution is possible. So I'll take a sip of water and then I'll read this long quote from Lenin. Jeez, sorry. To the Marxist, it is indisputable that a revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. Furthermore, it is not every revolutionary situation that leads to revolution. What, generally speaking, are the symptoms of a revolutionary situation? We shall certainly not be mistaken if we indicate the following three major symptoms. One, when it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without any change. when there is a crisis in one form or another among the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient to have the lower classes not want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should not be able to live in the old way. 2, when the suffering and want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. 3, when, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses who uncomplainingly allow themselves to be robbed in peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn both by the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historic action. Without these objective conditions, which are independent of the will, not only of individual groups and parties, but even of individual classes, revolution, as a general rule, is impossible. The totality of all these objective changes is called a revolutionary situation. Such a situation existed in 1905 in Russia and in all the revolutionary periods in the West. It also existed in Germany in the 60s of the last century, and in Russia in 1859 to 61 and 1879 to 1880, although no revolution occurred in these circumstances. Why was that? It was because it is not every revolutionary situation that gives rise to a revolution. A revolution arises only out of a situation in which the above-mentioned objective changes are accompanied by a subjective change, namely the ability of the revolutionary class to take revolutionary mass action strong enough to break or dislocate the old government, which never, not even in a period of crisis, falls if it is not toppled over. Okay, we have here actually a tremendous amount of information that I want to sift a little bit. First, we have a condition of objective impossibility for the ruling class. That is to say, the ruling class, or classes in the case of a state like Tsarist Russia, where there's a feudal nobility and also the capitalist monarchist ruling class, they are constrained by objective circumstances. They can no longer go on ruling as they have. They have to change things. Now, they have some freedom within that to change things a bit, but they can't just end the capitalist mode of production or just force the crisis to go away. And we're seeing a whole series of factors that are driving the US ruling class to precisely this sort of objective crisis. Not only the economic downturn, not only the defeat in the Iran war, the incredible backlash against Israel now in the US relations with Israel, the decline geopolitically, the weakening of NATO, the rise of China, the US literally and its allies, not just the US, but also the US and NATO allies being kicked out of a lot of countries in Africa and elsewhere, and so on. Not to mention just the mass discontent with both parties as they try to bring out AOCIA, as people call her. It's kind of a bad pun, like one of those leftist speak things, but it's kind of funny. After all, she got her start backed by Israeli venture capital. Literally her start. But also with Zoran or Graham Plantner, or now Hunter Biden owning the MAGA people on Twitter, but also on the right with James Fishback or Dan Blazarian or all this stuff. The ruling class in the US is trying new methods of class rule to some degree. They can't go on ruling as they have been on a lot of different levels. But then also on the subjective side, the will of the people actually, because ultimately it's the popular classes that have the freedom within a certain historical constraint to create a new society. Provided they're able to break from their slumber, which people, and it's kind of an incredible thing of human resiliency, that people can put up with the incredible brutal conditions that they face under capitalism for a time. But eventually, people refuse to put up with it. But not only they can fight back, but fight back with sufficient clarity and organizational force and unity to topple the ruling classes. And that really is the question that's in front of us, is in the coming upheaval, first of all, outside of our control and outside of even the control of the ruling classes, will the masses of people rise up? And it's easy to look at the last few decades and say, probably not, maybe we'll get another Occupy. But remember, things change a tremendous amount. For example, the largest post-World War II rebellion that occurred in Europe happened in France in May 68. where 10 million workers largely spontaneously went on strike and were joined by students all across the country. I mean, this toppled de Gaulle, it shook France to its very core, and it created a revolutionary situation in France, a situation which unfortunately no forces were able to take advantage of. People didn't see that coming. There was discontent, sure, but nothing like that. 10 million people in a much smaller country in the US going on strike spontaneously. So these sort of explosions do happen, actually. And if you look at just how angry people on the left and the right are right now with the ruling class, not just with Trump, I mean, Trump's base is very mad at him, his former base, but also with the Democrats, I mean, across the board, all this association with Epstein, their total cowardice, etc. We have a circumstance which could lead to a sort of similar mass uprising. And then the question becomes, if such a thing does occur, and it doesn't always occur, even in very favorable circumstances for it to occur, are there revolutionary forces which are prepared ideologically, politically, organizationally, to take advantage of such a movement, to navigate all the complexities, and to work at the level of the mass movement to solve these problems? How do you build the unity of the people? Not in slogans, not by just saying, we're all on the same side, let's all get together. Because anyone who knows anything about the 60s and 70s knows that there was a whole bunch of small little sectarian groups, even sometimes big sectarian groups, who refused to find ways to work together and misled the movement, but also a huge and complex apparatus brought forth by the state to divide the people, to pit them against each other and to destroy groups. And you got to be able to navigate all that. And only if all those things go right is it possible to take advantage of not only economic downturns and crashes and crises, but also the upheavals that sometimes come with them, and then make revolution. So let's talk possible paths in front of us in the US. Now, these are not exhaustive, but these are what I see as the three most likely possible paths for the US. The first, and I think it's not the most likely, but it's worth noting because it's the most favorable, is the 1905 revolution in Russia. In 1905, the Bolshevik Party existed. It was weak and disorganized. 1905 largely caught the Bolsheviks by surprise. And in fact, most of the party members in Russia didn't even want to participate in the Workers' Council, the Soviets that were set up. They didn't understand the importance of them initially. Lenin from abroad was writing to them polemically, you have to get involved. It's insane that we're not involved in this, but that's a story for another day. Russia was defeated in a war against rising Japan, rising imperialist power in that period, humiliatingly defeated. And the masses of people really lost faith in the Tsar and in the ruling classes. The ruling classes were fighting themselves in Russia over this defeat. And the efforts they had, including the direct police efforts to contain the spontaneous outrages of the masses, failed. And then there was a big crackdown on a mass, actually appeal of people to the Tsar. This was not a radical protest, actually, that happened in 1905 to start the revolution. It was a group of people who went to the Tsar to beg him, hey, please give us a constitution. We know you want to, we know you're good-hearted, but you're being tricked by your ministers. Give us a constitution. And what did the Tsar's government do? Brutally massacre these protesters. And this was sort of the spark that set off the revolution. And you can imagine similar miscalculations. We're already seeing to some extent those with ICE agents just brutalizing people and so on. You don't need that sort of spark to get a revolutionary movement, but it does sometimes set things off. The point with the historical parallel is after the defeat in a foreign war that revealed to the people the weakness of the empire in which they lived and the incompetence of the ruling class, a certain degree of subjective freedom was opened up for the masses as they broke from their long slumber and as the ruling classes were fighting amongst themselves. And a huge revolutionary movement emerged spontaneously, without real leadership or guidance from the existing parties in Russia. Then this revolution failed. And after it followed a period of very brutal reaction known as the Stolpin reaction in Russia. But 12 short years later, there was the October Revolution, or first the February, then the October Revolution, and the establishment of the first socialist country in the world. So this sort of possibility is really in front of the US. I'm not saying an immediate socialist revolution, but a huge revolutionary upheaval in the country. I'm not saying tomorrow or this year, but it's a real possibility that's on the table because you see. Who saw Trump talking about the reflecting pool? Okay, so this is how stupid the US ruling class is. It's hard to overstate. Trump got a giant graphic printed out, like this big, of the reflecting pool by the Washington Monument. And it was like the reflecting pool is this long. And then it's like other skyscrapers are not as big as the reflecting pool. I'm not kidding, go look it up. And he's talking about how much bigger it is. And all the skyscrapers are US skyscrapers, but he's like, our pool is bigger than theirs. And there's this whole weird Freudian, like, dick measuring contest going on, like with US buildings, but also like length of pool, height of skyscrapers, like, but you have to see how stupid the US ruling class is that this is happening. And there's no one there like checking this. And if they're not checking this, like what ideas are they not letting him do? Like what sort of crazy stuff does he want to go and do? But more than that, the US ruling class, they've gone all in on OnlyFans and Polymarket. Like that's their solution for economic development to defeat China? No, it doesn't make any sense. So they're very dumb. And they're not handling the Iran war defeat well, and they're really not dealing with a lot of what's happening in the country and around the world. They're not managing the empire's decline well at all. And they're actually rapidly intensifying it. So this sort of crisis leading to major revolutionary upheavals is possible, especially when they're doing everything to alienate people on the left, or really on the Republican base and the Democratic Party base, and give them basis to unite against, Zionism, against the surveillance state, against the corruption at every level, and so on. So this is one possible path. Another looks somewhat more like the Great Depression. Now, I want to be square. In all of these, we don't want to be too literal in our comparison. It's a rough guidelines. But with the Great Depression, you have a major economic collapse in 1929. And it's not actually until the economy starts to recover in 33 that you have a real uptick in political activity in the form of unions, struggles, and so on. There's some protests and stuff, but actually the Depression, because it was so hard for the people, and because the subjective forces were weak, and because the US ruling class was relatively unified in that period, and as well as a whole bunch of other contingent factors, there wasn't big mass protests right away, even as people's standard of living plummeted. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but this is possible, and it's not unprecedented in the US. A lot of times historically, look at Occupy actually. Occupy doesn't start in 2008. It starts in 2011, when the recovery is already a bit underway. So this is actually fairly typical for the US and around the world, that you have a big crash, a few years of really bad circumstances, and then once the masses feel like they've got a little bit more economic security, they're like, oh shit, okay, we're gonna start protesting and take to the street more and get organized a bit because we got a little more breathing room. That's a real possibility. And I think the most likely thing, even though the US ruling class is much more ideologically exposed right now than they were in the Great Depression. And then the third, and I think worst possibility for a variety of reasons, is in the short term, something more like modern Britain. Yeah, pretty brutal. And that's nothing against the British people. They have a very, very difficult circumstance right now, where basically since 2008, there's been zero economic growth outside of like speculative banking activities in the center of London. And there's just a huge rollout of surveillance everywhere. And there's a not quite fascist, but very intense surveillance state where if you make a joke mocking a politician, the police show up at your door and knock at your door and arrest you. Mao said that under the Soviet Union under Brezhnev's leadership had become a fascist country in the way they handled internal dissent. Well, in both absolute and per capita numbers, the current British state arrests, I think it's like in absolute numbers, like 1,000 times more people a year for speech violations than Brezhnev's government did. So it's a pretty crazy place right now. It's not really fascist, but I was at an event like a year ago, and there was a guy from Britain here, a leftist, kind of Marxist activist, and he was criticizing the government. He was like talking kind of quietly. I don't know really what I can say. I'm worried. And he meant about the US, but also about Britain. And there was a very interesting tweet, actually I should have put it in here, from Whitney Webb recently, who's sort of one of the preeminent researchers on Epstein and Palantir and so on in the US. She's very empirical, but her research is kind of thorough. And she argued that with Palantir and the social networks and so on, the US government has basically achieved its goals with creating the internet. And she says, look, all these tech companies, you can't see them as private companies. They're all funded initially by the CIA, either directly or indirectly. They're all extensions of the government, really, in the state, in a meaningful sense. And their goal was total surveillance of the whole population all the time. And you all know this. I mean, you talk about something on your phone, and then suddenly the next day there's an ad for it on your computer, on a different account. You know, it's not, your phone's not linked to your computer per se, it doesn't matter, it's there. And they've rolled out this surveillance architecture. All the phones are recording all the time, all the laptops are recording all the time. They have it in place. And has there been like huge mass protests in Britain against the declining standard of living, against the surveillance and repression and everything else? Not really. There's been some, and there's been some courageous protests, but the British ruling class has been very successful in dividing the population, and in particular in whipping up anti-immigrant fervor to divide the people. And then also convincing the left that all of the anger people have about like some of the liberal parties and stuff is right-wing opposition. Now, a subsection of left is more clear, but a lot of the left was basically glad to just dismiss any anger at or support for the kind of vaguely right-wing populist movements as inherently reactionary. And this divide and rule strategy has been fairly successful for the British ruling class in managing their absolute decline as an imperialist power. From a global empire a little over 100 years ago that spanned a quarter of the world, literally a quarter of the world's landmass, and controlled a quarter of the world's population, to a pretty weak power totally dependent on the US. Now this scenario, while somewhat likely for the US, there's some obvious differences. The Brits were able to do something of a managed decline since 45 because of the key role they played in the US-led system. The US is likely not likely to be given such favorable terms by the Chinese ruling class as they outcompete the US on a global scale. So we could see a more rapid decline of the US, but this sort of somehow managed decline, or decline without so much in the way of mass protests and kind of begrudging acceptance and success of the ruling class in brutally dividing the people as new forms of repression are rolled out, is a real possibility. It's a very dark possibility, but we have to consider it. That doesn't mean it's that forever, but historically, over and over again within the Marxist movement, there's been a tendency to conflate the growing pains of capitalism with its dying pains. I mean, Lenin does this to some extent when he talks about imperialism as moribund. Him and the Bolsheviks believed, and it was a common belief, that with the First World War, there would soon be the end of global capitalism, and the capitalist countries would fall one domino after another, and you'd have the world socialist revolution. That didn't happen, and they adjusted, Lenin quicker than most, and we can't fault them for being overly optimistic. But we can't now, with the benefit of hindsight, think that the coming economic crisis means the end of capitalism. As Lenin himself says, if you don't hit it, they're not going to fall. And this mistake was repeated in the Comintern with what was called general crisis theory, the Third International. They predicted correctly the coming of the Great Depression in 29. No one else really in the world believed it was going to happen. And the communist parties were like, oh, we're about to have a major crisis, we're about to have a major crisis, and they were right. But they thought capitalism would not recover. And it did. It took a massive depression and a world war, but it did. And so I want to be clear that we can't just say, oh, there's a big crisis coming, that's the end of capitalism. On the other hand, if we look at a possibility, the negative possibility, like Britain today, where if the US were to follow a similar path, we'd have a relative stabilization of the US as a weakened imperialist power. That's not the end. That would just be the new situation in which we'd have to operate. Very challenging situation, harder than if there's a mass revolutionary movement in certain regards, but by no means an impossible one. And those situations are generally only overwhelming when revolutionaries fail to consider them as a possibility. And that's what happened in the 60s and 70s too, where a huge number of revolutionaries thought, you know, revolution in our lifetimes. The Panthers said it, a lot of the groups said it. It's gonna happen, it's coming soon. And then it didn't. And then in the Reagan era in the 80s, people had no fucking clue what to do. And most groups fell apart. So regardless of what comes next, and I'm optimistic that the conditions will get more favorable, but regardless of what comes next, we have to be prepared and ready. And if there are big openings, then we really have to be ready. And in a certain sense, that's more scary, because that means we have to get our shit together and get it together quickly. And we can think of all on an individual level, but also in all the organizing we've done, all the amateurism, all the navel gazing, all the petty fighting. And I'm not saying unify without principles, but all the petty infighting and the sectarianism and the little bullshit where you can't even talk about the important questions that are right in front of you. I mean, if that's what dominates the US left, and we miss a once-in-a-lifetime crisis, and it passes us by without accomplishing anything, damn. Future generations are going to be right to look at us and go, okay, Zoomer, you wasted your chance. I'll conclude there. I have a lot more, in a certain sense, to talk about on the technical side, on the political side, but we'll save it for the Q&A. Thank you all. And just to clarify, I'm a millennial, not a Zoomer, but it was too good of a line to pass up, and it just came to me. Okay, questions. We'll do them in batches of 3. I'll call in 3 people, and then I'll answer their questions. Generally, when there's not immediately questions, it's because people are intimidated by the scope of the analysis or the technical side, is my guess, and aren't sure how to formulate a question. I see 1 in the back, 2. I will start with those 2. Go ahead. The question is, given the current situation and the analysis here in this presentation, what should people who aren't currently involved in any organizing do to seize on the openings that will likely occur? The first is, and I think this is always where we have to start, is study. Now, I'm not saying just study, you need to organize too, but in the prevailing American culture where pragmatism, show me the results, or what have you done for me lately, reigns supreme. You gotta do stuff, you just gotta do stuff, go in the streets, march, do mutual aid, help your community, whatever, like these sort of like self-help Instagram posts about getting started. Let's be square. The capitalist class has a whole series of institutions internationally that have a several hundred-year history of knowledge. The institutions themselves often aren't several hundred years, but they have these institutions which have hundreds of years of knowledge and experience of how to run capitalist society, of how to deal with crises and protests and strikes and mass movements and revolutions, and how to kill them, and how to defang them, and how to direct them into one dead end or another. I mean, if you don't think the US ruling class consciously coordinated the rise of Barack Obama to take all the anger about the foreign wars and channel it into nothing, while the wars continued and intensified, then you're out of your mind. So if we don't study and we don't learn the lessons of history and of all the popular struggles, as well as the strategies of the ruling class to destroy those struggles and defang them, then we're hopeless. But in conjunction with studying, people need to organize. The question then becomes how? Because again, there's a lot of 3 easy steps to make a difference in your community type guides people see. And I'm being a bit tongue in cheek, but that's effectively what I think a lot of those Instagram type guides are. The reality is that a lot of what happens in the US left is unfortunately little more than charity through so-called mutual aid stuff, or stumping for one politician or another, therefore aiding the Democratic Party. These are dead ends. What's needed in particular is for people who have not yet organized to get involved in communist organizing, which means a few different things, but in particular, it means in the process of learning Marxist theory, taking it to the revolutionary class, the working class, and getting involved in the existing and ongoing working class struggles. Because Marxism teaches us that it's the proletariat, the working class, and the working class alone, which has a unique interest in overcoming all forms of oppression and exploitation. And so the workers have to be taught and trained in the course of struggle, not only how to fight their own struggles against the capitalists, against the reactionary union leaders, and how to build the unity of their own class, that got kind of loud, but also how to lead all the other oppressed strata and sections of the society. The workers have to learn about the struggles of immigrants, about the struggles of oppressed minorities, religious groups, about the struggles of queer people, etc., about the unique nature of the Black struggle in the US. And they have to understand those from a working class perspective. Because if you go out, and talk to some, petty bourgeois queer activists, they're going to understand a number of things about the queer struggle. But a lot of it will be filtered through, for example, where a lot of people operate, that petty bourgeois NGO style of organizing, which, while often diagnosing a number of problems in the society, leads to the dead end of city council hearings and various forms of really ultimately opposing elements of the capitalist system without ever getting to the root. And then often the capitalists are very successful in taking that form of opposition and funneling it back into functional support of the system. And we see this all the time with so-called progressive city councilors, who really are often the best support in terms of winning popularity to shore up the weakness of the capitalist system. Just think about our current mayor, Zora. I mean, that's what he was. Progressive city councilor, right? Or assemblyman, whatever, to mayor. Okay. So hopefully that answers. There's a lot more to be said, but it's a kind of big question in a certain sense.
You talked about a number of different countries losing confidence in not investing in US dollar, but having their gold invested in the US. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that correctly or recounting correctly, but something that I'm curious about is why is Israel still a strong partner with the US and in some ways strengthening their partnership. For example, the fusion between the two militaries has been codified just yesterday in a House of Representatives meeting, where it was like Benjamin Netanyahu's idea to strengthen this partnership. So I'm just wondering, why is it that Israel also probably sees the decline of the U.S., but wants to bolster the partnership?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Can you just give me some more water? Thank you. Sorry, it's just very warm in here. And yeah, the question is, why is the U.S.-Israel partnership strengthening right now? And in particular, while the U.S. is declining, and you referenced the recent bill, I don't think it's been formally signed into law yet, to fuse the U.S. and the Israeli military. The answer is somewhat complicated. I actually see the push for a much greater degree of partnership between the U.S. and Israel as a sign of the incredible weakness right now of the U.S. ruling class, and in particular of the fear that the U.S. ruling class has around the popular anger about U.S.-Israeli relations. Now, the Israeli ruling class are really, I think, a subsection of the U.S. ruling class. It's sort of this little, like, militarized settler enclave the U.S. has carved out in the Middle East. And if you look at the biggest, supporters of Zionism, the biggest billionaires in the U.S., people like Larry Ellison and so on, the biggest donors to the Friends of the IDF charity, they're integral to actually not just supporting Israel as a state, but actually running it in a meaningful sense. And in the face of broad public awareness of really what Israel is, this genocidal state where it's fairly common for leading religious figures to talk about how I saw this video, I'm forgetting his name, this rabbi, saying there's too many goyim, there's 6 billion goyim in the world, and that number's too many, needs to be reduced. I mean, that's a crazy statement. Those are going viral on social media. People are saying, holy shit, like this is a guy saying like they need to maybe kill billions or something. Like, what the fuck is that? I mean, that's a real reactionary state. I mentioned this in a previous presentation, but Israel's the only country in the world where there's mass protests for the right to rape, which occur regularly. So there's broad public awareness of this now. We've had a genocide broadcast in 4K over the last few years, where Israeli soldiers are glad to show their war crimes, like glad to show them to the world. And there's really anger like never before amongst the US populace. A lot of people who are like, oh yeah, Israel, kind of is a democracy, or I don't really know, it's not so, I don't like Netanyahu, but the Muslim countries seem bad because of US propaganda or something like that. People are like, holy shit. And the breakdown across the base of both parties, I mean, it's freaking the US ruling class out. Not just the Zionists, but the US ruling class as a whole. In the section that really supports Israel, they're desperate for measures that will shore this up. This is not just the Republicans. Actually, like AOC and others in the Democratic Party, they're very cleverly pushing for these military integration as a way to say they're reducing aid to Israel. Because if you budget this as part of the US military budget, then you're no longer giving Israel military aid, you're just doing the National Defense Authorization Act for the US military. That happens to also include the Israeli military. But there's a few different factors beyond this. Israel's in a very bad position. They're getting beaten up very bad by Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're forced to retreat now. Their only real option, they're saying, is the Dahia Doctrine, to just flatten civilian areas in Lebanon. They're unpopular everywhere around the world. I mean, everywhere. US NATO allies are no longer supporting them. And they also have faced domestic political crisis after crisis. I mean, before October 7th, there was like 7 elections in 5 years in Israel. They have a kind of snap election system where if the government loses a majority in parliament, there has to be an election. But there can be, it can be forced. So the ruling class there has faced crisis after crisis. I think they're heading very rapidly towards military dictatorship as the only viable option domestically. That's functionally what it's becoming. And to enforce that, they need closer integration with the US, but also the US military wants a closer handle on them. Because what we've seen is, it is advantageous for the US to leave it to Bibi, as they said in previous policy papers, let Netanyahu do the bad things and we'll kind of let him take the blame too, and then we play the role of kind of controlling, putting the leash on Netanyahu, and anyone who reads Axios and IDF, Mossad agent maybe, Barak Ravid's articles, he's one of the journalists at Axios, it's always like, oh, Biden's reining in Netanyahu, Trump's screaming at Netanyahu, called him a fucking idiot. These sort of journalists who write this sort of stuff to basically say it's not the US's fault, Israel's breaking the ceasefire or committing genocide. They're at their end of the rope. Of course, if the president wanted to stop Israel from bombing, they just don't give them the bombs. But there is, even though Israel is this sort of enclave the US has set up, there is a difference. There's a distinct and independent military and so on. And I think the US ruling class, even the strong supporters of Israel, are worried, namely that they can't really control Netanyahu so well. And the Israeli military, they want a tighter leash on them because they want to make sure that when they say stop, let's have a ceasefire, that the Israeli ruling class, the military stops. And so they want a more direct integration. And I think that's a big part of this too. But overall, this is a sign of weakness and fear. And once you have that direct control, it's not so easy to say, oh, this was just Bibi. You know, they have to acknowledge really the basics here, that this is integrated US-Israeli military. One, other questions? 2, 3?
Spoke of the possibility of the United States going down the path of modern Britain, with Trump dropping the aliens.gov website where he basically just puts forward there's aliens that walk among us and that mean immigrants. With Palantir, I'm curious as to what are the developments that we can see in the upcoming years in terms of the surveillance state and the divisions that the ruling class are trying to sow.
It's a great question. I'll answer briefly. The question is, given the possible parallels to modern Britain and the surveillance state there, and all the stuff happening with Palantir and the aliens.gov website about illegal aliens that Trump has put out, and ICE, what are the expansions we're likely to see in the surveillance state, and how's that going to play out? I'll answer briefly. We're going to have an event on the 26th here, 26th, right? Yeah. United States of Surveillance, about this very question. So it's something of a preview. But I think what we're seeing now is the largest and most coordinated effort the US state has ever carried out for proper total data capture. And I alluded to this earlier, but every single second, everyone's phone is recording. Every audio and video, all that being shipped all the time. We carry around the wiretaps with us. We have multiple on us. They're in our bedrooms, sensing us while we sleep. All that data shipped all the time to these giant AI processing centers and computed. Not just to spy on us, but also for advertising. They said they want to create and control all trends with AI, all advertising trends for social control. I mean, when they, attacked the Panthers in the 60s and 70s, they made psychological profiles of them and tried to attack them based on that. It's kind of semi-pseudoscience, but they were able to do that to some degree. I mean, they're talking about the next generation of AirPods. You know what they're going to have? They're going to have brain sensors. They filed a patent for it, brain sensors in your brain, and they're going to have cameras on the AirPods to watch everything, to help you in case you're looking at something. You'd be like, what's in my kitchen right now? Now, and I'll mention that in a second, but this is a new level of surveillance they're trying to roll out. Now, AI is pretty dumb and remains pretty dumb in a lot of ways. So there'll be a lot of subjectivism, and they need people to do this surveillance. And so there's going to be a lot of dissent about this. And they're going to go after people in all sorts of new and crazy ways. And there'll be a lot of people in the security state to one degree or another who dissent over it. There always are. So I don't want to give the idea they're all powerful by any means. I mean, look at this shit with Polymarket and their idiocy and their Iran war. They're going to make lots of miscalculations. But they're trying to build the biggest ever digital prison. Britain was a testing ground. They want to do it bigger here, much bigger and much more scary. That's why they're building a data center 3 times the size of Manhattan in Utah. And I was going to say something else about this. Oh, and they also really want to dumb down the population. I mean, they've been doing it for years. They have all sorts of trends they promote to dumb people down. But Sam Altman was very explicit. He said, in the future, intelligence will be a utility you rent. Any question? You don't know how to do anything. You're just a serf. You just say, oh, what's this? And you got some government, fact-checked, approved, corporate, sanitized answer. That's what they want. They don't want books. I mean, they're very clear about this, the AI companies. They want to gobble up, scan, and destroy all books. Like, actually, they're going for all the rare books now and stuff. They're destroying them. So they want a stupid, addicted to all sorts of slop. Both digital slop, poisonous food, a whole bunch of drugs to numb you out, population that they can easily control, that's compliant and afraid. And the fear is the biggest thing. Because even if people don't get dumbed down, and even if people resist to some extent the surveillance, if people are afraid, they're compliant. And that's what we saw after 9/11. There's a lot more to be said on this topic. We'll do a whole event on it, but that's a little preview of a snapshot. And personally, I'm an optimist. I want to be square about that. I think if you study the situation, there's a lot to be optimistic about in terms of the infinite capacity of the masses to fight and to create new ways of resistance and to win, ultimately. But I'm a total opponent of the naive optimism, of the self-help book, of the power of now, of the ways in which supposedly just with the power of positive thinking, you can manifest the future you want to see. No, it's bullshit. And that's been sold to us by the very same ruling class who also wants us depressed. They're either depressed or magical thinking that you can overcome all your problems. The only way forward is a rational appraisal of the challenges of the situation we're in, and then a unified collective effort to overcome it. That's the only way forward. And it's scary, but that's reality. We have to deal with it. And once you stop running away from the reality and stop being afraid that things are bad, and the more you look into it, the more you realize how fucked up the situation is. And the more you study revolutionary history, the more you realize actually there's tremendous reasons to be optimistic. But optimism has to be grounded in, as Lenin put it, a concrete analysis of the concrete situation.
So, to my understanding, the global economy is in kind of a unique spot historically. Like, we have the 2 major imperialist powers that are dependent on one another economically, and with a massive depression, I think the U.S. is inevitably going to hit the Chinese, and the U.S. relies a lot on Chinese production, and Chinese also rely on the U.S. as a pretty big market for commodities. So, what are some of the scenarios you see playing out for the Chinese economy? When the AI bubble pops and all this stuff starts to.
The question is, the world economy is in a very unique situation where the 2 largest empires are totally economically dependent on each other. So what will the impact of this new Great Depression be on China? It's a great question because, when the US was competing with the Soviet Union, once the Soviet Union had restored capitalism, They were basically separate economically. And in the earlier periods, while the global capitalist, the imperialist powers did some global trade with each other, basically they all had exclusive domains of colonies, and they sold goods and stuff to each other, but it wasn't this degree of economic dependence, where the US requires hundreds of billions of dollars a year of Chinese goods, and the Chinese companies go bankrupt if they don't sell hundreds of billions of dollars a year of goods to the US. Both are in a real pickle. A major economic downturn in China is incredibly destabilizing. The Chinese Communist Party is already facing massive problems in terms of domestic stability because of the anger of young people. There's a whole mass social movement called lying flat, which is, somewhat nihilistic, but it's like, why do the 996 kind of Jack Ma style regimented 9 to 9, 6 days a week, 12-hour workdays, 6 days a week to get ahead? It's pointless, it's stupid, it's bullshit. We're being sold this myth, China's gotta, defeat the US and claim a rightful place in the world. My rightful place is to waste my whole youth slaving away to make someone else rich? And there's been a huge number of rural revolts in China against, bank defaults and so on. China has the largest proletariat in the world by a large degree. The period of, capital accumulation that the Chinese ruling class has gone on since the restoration of capitalism in China after '76 is unprecedented. You have a very, very, very big proletariat, a very organized proletariat that's been fighting a huge number of strikes year after year. Now, what's lacking is real revolutionary leadership of those strikes and of the movement in China. But a major economic depression in the US will create huge, huge economic problems in China, which will in turn lead to huge political problems. China's very different than the US. I mean, the people there, everyone's like, oh yeah, we know it's not socialist. Everyone knows this country's capitalist. And there's a real memory amongst the people of the revolutionary society. And a huge number of young people, after 2020 especially, all started reading Mao. What the hell went wrong in our country? Mao warned about this. We're not allowed to read Mao in this country, but Mao warned about it. They're not allowed to read Mao's writings from the Cultural Revolution, actually. Mao warned about this. And so you have this mass movement to the point that now, and they're starting to bring this to the US, but the government has declared that universities are potential sites of terrorism. And so every classroom basically in China has cameras watching the university students in their lectures all the time because there's such fear about actual real Marxist study circles, not pro-Chinese imperialist study circles, getting started at campuses. And you can tell how afraid a ruling class is by how much domestic repression they bring. In China, they had, long before the US, these kind of AI smart cities surveilling everyone. It gives a sense, it gives a real sense of how afraid they are. So, with all this stuff, I think two sayings from Mao are very important to keep in mind. The first is, the future is bright, but the road is tortuous. Not torturous, but tortuous. Winding, turning, lots of twists and turns in front of us. But the second is, there's great disorder under heaven. The situation is excellent. And I've said this before, maybe in a presentation, I can't remember. Could you imagine being born in the 60s, kind of growing up, kind of knowing there's some political movements when you're a kid, and then coming into adulthood in the 80s? And then living through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, 2010s, and wait, is something gonna happen? Is middle-class suburbia the pinnacle of human existence? Is this the end of history? Is it all over? Just one genocide after another, while Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and Barack Obama run over the world and drone strike everyone who disagrees? I mean, that's pretty bleak. Now, because many of us were kids in a period of relatively greater economic and political stability, it can be easy to look back at those periods and feel some warm nostalgia. Oh, it was so nice when things were easier. Really? When how many people were sent to an early grave from drone strikes or from hunger and poverty and starvation? That's the sort of peace we want? I mean, we should disabuse ourselves of that imperialist notion. And really try to think historically about what's coming. The rapid fall, if not total collapse, of a global empire that's ruled the world for 70 years in which we live. If that's not a cause for excitement, I understand some nerves, but for excitement, I don't know what is. And the openings that will occur, and you raise the question of China, there and around the world because of this are going to be tremendous. Where they will be most favorable is hard to say, and where they'll be seized upon best is impossible to say. But we know what's coming to some degree. Alice?
It's a bit similar to the last question. I was just sort of wondering, like the thing that you cited of the Chinese intelligence assessment that like they are in the U.S. and just have to like wait for it to be managed to fall or something. I don't know. I mean, I think probably the Chinese middle class has some functional requirement to be a little bit more objective than the U.S. middle class right now. Where like they're just like something to be like, oh look, we have this big pool or whatever. But yeah, is that really accurate? Like, there's a lot of, I mean, there's an interesting account related to like the possibility of more class struggle breaking out in China. There's a lot of studies that consciousness resistance. There's also like the demographic situation and everything. So I don't know how realistic you think that assessment is.
The question is, how realistic do I think the intelligence assessment from the Chinese Security Service is that the U.S. is now in decline and the strategic offensive of U.S. imperialism against China is over? I think it's accurate. I don't think this means that China will have no significant difficulties. In fact, the Chinese ruling class, because of their domestic political situation and their economic dependence on the U.S. market, could actually be hit harder than the U.S. imperialists in certain regards. You have that big of a proletariat. It's hard to deal with for a capitalist class, even the capitalist class. In a certain sense, especially for a capitalist class that calls themselves a communist party. But in terms of the willingness of the US imperialists to aggressively and militarily fight to contain China, it's not there. I mean, the Iran war showed the math. With basically 10 missiles, Iran could destroy any US military base reliably, at least its capacity to project power in the region. The same is true for every single US base in the Pacific. From Chinese technology, that's actually much of it's more advanced than the Iranians. The US ruling class is looking at that math. The ones who are relatively intelligent, they know. That's why Trump wouldn't say shit about Taiwan when he came back from China. They've accepted they can't hold on to everything. They cut a deal. That's why all the CEOs went to China. They cut some deal. We don't know the details of it yet, but some grand bargain. And this is what, it's not so crazy to note this. This is what Kissinger and a section of the ruling class have been advocating for a long time. Tucker said it openly on his show. He said, the US is a great power, but we're not the only great power anymore. You have to accept that reality. Or if you don't accept reality, what happens? You lose. So I believe the US ruling class has basically accepted that they can't contain the rise of China now. This is very different from 2-3 years ago, where actually as Trump was, on the campaign trail, the US ruling class by and large consolidated the think tanks, a lot of the military people, intelligence agencies around a massive plan to contain China. But then Trump got into office. They didn't implement it. It's very interesting, actually, this happened. They had the coalition, they had the support, but a section of the US ruling class, a lot of them weren't interested in this plan because it would have cost them too much money, too much investments in China, too much money to be made off cheap Chinese goods in the US, too many short-term profit losses. And so we got the, OnlyFans polymarket plan instead. And that's what the economy's become. I mean, by and large, they didn't do a significant reindustrialization of most industries they'd planned to do. They did a little bit, but there was a whole plan they had to deal with the rise of China, and they dropped it. They basically abandoned it. And that's quite notable, actually. It was honestly surprising they were that dumb. The capitalists are dumb to some degree. If you see them be that dumb, it's like, holy shit. So I think that assessment is largely correct, that the US just is backing off. Now, it's possible that through some things you get a real war hawk in there, or the Chinese ruling class oversteps significantly and the US ruling class rallies behind an assessment that actually more military action is needed to contain China. But I don't see them getting their production in order here. If the US ruling class wants to contain China, what do they have to do? They've got to start actually producing missiles and drones and ships and planes and bombs and everything else that they can't produce for the Iran war, that they had years to prepare for the Ukraine war they didn't do. They didn't do it after the Ukraine war, and they haven't started to do it meaningfully since the Iran war started. And that's like a 5 to 10 year plan to fix those problems in production, if not longer. I don't think they do it. They just haven't shown the organizational capabilities. They haven't shown the organizational will as a class, and they're too corrupt. And just to say bluntly, I thought the Biden administration was very corrupt. The Hunter Biden scandal, just the 10% for the big man, all these business deals, it was, on par with Lyndon Johnson, if not more, and he was very corrupt. And then you get Trump in there, and it's just open looting of everything. I mean, it's honestly just baffling. I don't think we've ever seen a ruling class this quickly, as Seth Hart put it, he's, wrote the Fort Bragg Cartel, shoot itself in the dick. That's a bit vulgar, but it's not just the foot. It's like they're shooting themselves in their own ability to reproduce as a class. And it's really striking. And I'm not saying they're done and it's all over or anything. I don't want to be hyperbolic. Oh my God, sorry, I hit this mic 10 times. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but it's really striking. And I think a lot of people in the US, they're trained to see, I know this isn't your question, but I'll state it because I think it's important. Every bad thing the US ruling class does is indication of their strength. But the OnlyFans polymarket economy, the open corruption, that's weakness. That's the structural problems that destroy empires. That's not strength. You have to keep a lid on the corruption. You can't just let everyone loot everything that's not nailed down. I mean, you know what screwworm is? Screwworm is a parasite, a worm that spreads into animals, again in humans too, but it's mainly a problem for cattle. The US for a long time had eliminated screwworm. They did it by basically that they're spread through flies. They drop these flies, sterile versions of these flies, and they push them all the way out of the US, all the way down through Mexico, all through Central America, all the way to Panama. And they decided that we're not going to deal with this in South America because it'd be too expensive to continue dropping sterile flies to stop the reproduction of the flies that spread them coming north. But they had this for years. Every year they go and they drop the flies, mating seasons in Panama, and the screwworms, which live in this fly spread, don't come north. With Doge, they cut it. It was a very cheap program. Basically meant that all the cattle in America, and the US in particular, didn't have to deal with this very devastating parasite and all the related medical expenses and then therefore the cost of beef and so on. They cut under Doge. A year and a half later, screwworm's back. First case in Texas just this week. This is gonna devastate cattle that are already at, I think, the lowest they've been since like 1953 or something, which means beef, which is a staple of the American diet, is only gonna go higher. That's not long-term thinking, that's idiocy. They didn't cut the $9,000 coffee cups that the Air Force uses. They didn't cut the huge waste to the F-35 programs, other programs that are like that. They cut the screwworm program, the one that stops the terrible parasite from infecting the cattle and killing off the cattle herds or devastating it. So that's the sort of decisions they've been making. And I think that helps to clarify to some extent the present, just almost mind-boggling idiocy of the ruling class. Other questions? 1, 2. Okay, we'll do those two and then we'll wrap. Can you speak up just a little bit? Sorry.
With Americans climbing efficacy, is a possible path? Do you envision a scenario in which there's a balkanization of the US?
Could I envision a scenario with the decline of the US that there's a balkanization? In the short term, no. The reason for this is that barring a world war, you don't likely have the United States split into separate countries. There's not the type of economic and national differences in the United States that were in the Balkans that could serve as an objective social basis for that sort of splitting of the country. Because the former Yugoslavia, it didn't fully resolve the national differences or even the economic relative to independence of the member nations. And, prior to the US Civil War, for example, such a division was entirely possible. You had two distinct modes of production and two relative independent economies. In fact, the British, because of their dependence on the American South for cotton, were strongly considering intervening on the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War. It was actually Marx and Engels, who were at the time residing in England, who played an integral role through their organizing of the working class movement in Britain to basically check the British ruling class's ability to intervene and basically force them to back off doing so. Little known history. But without that sort of objective basis of economic, political, and or national divisions in the country, the balkanization isn't likely. That said, if the US loses the war, a world war, it's entirely possible. That would require the occupation of the United States by a foreign power, likely China or Russia. Obviously, after World War II, Germany was split in two. Actually, the Dulles brothers, one of them founded the CIA, were advocates of balkanizing Germany. They wanted to, after World War II, split Germany back up into a huge number of princely states, like it had been prior to Bismarck's unification of the country. But the Soviet Union opposed that. So I don't see a scenario, short of World War and occupation, and I think there's not a precedent for that, short of that. But certainly if the US becomes fascist and then is defeated in a world war, occupying powers may well do that, but that's far afield from the present moment.
With the possible defeat of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, what prospects do you think exist for cryptocurrency to become more dominant and to be a more useful tool for the ruling class to oppress the masses?
The question is, with the declining status of the US dollar as a world reserve currency, what are the possibilities for cryptocurrency becoming a more important currency globally, and also for the ruling classes to oppress the people? The short answer is not much. Now, I need to be clear. Cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin in particular, was invented by the CIA. And they were proliferated by the government as a means by which they could facilitate drug trafficking, amongst other things. Cryptocurrencies are not very effective forms of currency. They're very good for illegal activity. They can be useful investment vehicles, but they're not great currencies. What we'll see instead, I think, is the proliferation of gold reserves, increasing of gold reserves, and various forms of basically bartering between countries that are not using the US dollar. The Chinese yuan is not presently viable as an alternative to the US dollar. In fact, China has been actually taking up, for example, in their agreement with Saudi Arabia, they are dealing with US dollar denominated trades with Saudi Arabia. They've been selling US dollar denominated securities to Saudi Arabia because of the role the dollar still plays in the global economy. In order for another currency like the yuan to replace the dollar as the world reserve currency, you likely need either massive political defeat of the US such that there really is a retreat of the US empire economically, globally, which would be more than on the immediate table with the current crisis, or the defeat of the US in a world war and the proper establishment of an alternative architecture. Systems like BRICS are more systems of barter and counter trade than proper Bretton Woods style alternatives to a dollar-led world. You also have $60 trillion worth of what's called euro dollars. These are US dollar denominated loans based in banks and given out by banks that are not based in the US. This is the piping that underlies most of the global financial architecture. I was going to get into all this. I have the whole slide that deals with this whole question. I didn't. I decided not to. I saw people's eyes glazing over and I was talking technical details and I was like, it's too much. I already knew it was going to be too much, but I had it there as a maybe. There's this whole clearinghouse system for global trades that's backed by US dollars. China is slowly and steadily setting up an alternative to it, which does not rely on crypto. This alternative is not significantly accepted and won't be accepted until China is largely the unquestioned hegemon around the world. And much more likely, we'll see a series of regional powers whose currency have regional sway as opposed to that. But yet, the cryptocurrencies won't be the main source of global trade. They won't underlie, they'll be prominent in certain regards, but they won't underlie global trade as reserve currencies. What we will see for the domestic population is central bank digital currencies, which is a cashless society by means of which every single transaction is tracked. So it'll be the dollar or the yuan or the pound, but there'll be no more cash. That's what they're talking about openly, the ruling class, the US and others. There'll be no more cash. There will just be digital access to the money that you have to use to buy everything. And for all of your transactions, they'll be tracked. And if they want to debank you, it's way easier. They don't need to go to your bank. They just cut off your supply in a central way. I mean, already people across the country, since COVID and the truckers' protests, the Canadian truckers' protests, which were just built as some crazy reactionary movement of white supremacists, even though it was mostly Punjabi truckers in Canada, people have been debanked for taking stands against the government. It's only going to get worse. So the CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, will be used for that, unquestionably. All right. Thank you all for coming. We'll hang out, chat for a little while before we clear out.
Before you all go, Ryan was talking about studying as one of the most important
Here,
things.
just come back here and
Oh,
make an
okay.
announcement. No, we got to go behind the speaker so
Oh,
it's an
okay.
echo. I forgot. It's a great one.
Hi, my name is Wyatt. Before you all go, Ryan was talking about studying being a very important thing to do for organizing. And if you were like, wow, this was a very interesting study, I would like to study more with MCU. Don't worry, we got you. We're studying, actually starting our first study this coming Wednesday for our new syllabus, which is about class struggle after revolution and class struggle under socialism. So if you're wondering, like, what is socialism? What is the Chinese Revolution? What is the Cultural Revolution? What are all those, like, you know, Maoist youth in China talking about? How Mao warned us? What is that about? We're going to talk about that. We're going to study it very thoroughly over an 8-week syllabus. So please come out and sign up on here or come talk to one of the comrades that's in the crowd. And we'd love to have you come study with us. So I just wanted to do that before you all go. Thank you very much.
And one more announcement, I'm sorry. On the topic of studying, say you've got a comrade or a friend, and they're like, oh, cool, I heard you went to MCU study, it was fun, but I don't live in New York, and I can't move to New York, it's expensive, or I got family, or whatever, I got a good job that actually I can pay my bills in the coming depression, I live not in New York. Damn, what do you do? Well, the exciting thing is that starting in August or September, exact date's not set, we're gonna have an online study again. So we'll put out more stuff about that, but if you got a friend who's interested, just let them know, and once, if you're on our mailing lists or whatever, get our updates. Once we have the syllabus and everything finalized, we'll share it in there as well as on our Instagram.